everyone. As you can hopefully read okay up there, I'm Steve Engledow. I work in the professional services team here in AWS UK. I'm going to be talking about development workflows on AWS. Essentially, this is a session where I get to be pretty opinionated about my development workflow, be interested in feedback from everyone else about your workflows, how you make things work. I'm going to be talking about things like CodeCommit, CodePipeline, CodeBuild, how I get an application. In fact, I'm going to walk through a sample application through from development locally through to deployed. The when is correct, that's GMT. So here's the agenda. I'm going to walk through some of the services that I'll be talking about, talk about the target application, some principles, and then talk about various related stuff there. And I'll have time for Q&A at the end, hopefully. Although if you have any questions while I'm speaking, please do shout out. So first of all, a quick service overview. Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with most of these, but I'll just very quickly talk through the services that I'll be mentioning in my session. First up is CodeCommit. It's a managed version control. So Git, basically, right? It scales as you need. And integrates with a whole load of other services, AWS services and other third-party services. CodePipeline provides a continuous integration and delivery service. It integrates with CodeCommit, amongst other things, also third-party tools like GitHub, etc. I'll be showing you how you can use CodePipeline to build a multi-stage pipeline going from sort of source to test, build, deployment. I mentioned CodeBuild. CodeBuild plugs into the various stages of CodePipeline. It can be used in its own right as a service. Essentially, it just gives you a build system whereby you supply some source and you supply something to run on that source, and then you get an output artifact. I'll talk more about that later. So the sample application I'm going to talk about is it's pretty exciting, but we've only got an hour. There's some Python. It goes through a test. There's a build stage. I deploy it, and we see a success, and then profit from the amazing application, as you'll see later. So first up, I wanted to talk about some principles I try to apply to myself when I'm thinking about development. So the first of these is that everything is code, right? So when I say that, I mean infrastructure is code, the application is code, the tests are code, the build process is code, the whole pipeline is code. And if it's code, it's got to be version controlled. I'm going to use CodeCommit for that. You'll use GitHub or whatever you use today. That you can integrate any of those with what I'm going to talk about. If it's code, you need to test it. Right, I'm going to use CodeBuild for that. And automate everything, right? So your infrastructure can be automated, your tests can be automated, your build, your deployment, automate all of it. Straightforward, easy stuff. So I'm going to talk through source control a little bit. In particular, I'm going to talk through how I use CodeCommit, right? So starting off with the first two of the principles I mentioned a moment ago. Everything's a code, and all code must be version controlled. Therefore, everything must be version controlled. One of the things I like about CodeCommit is I know there are some features that it doesn't have that everyone wants, right? I'll mention some more about that later. But one of the great things about it is that it's API-driven, and you can use the AWS CLI to do things like create new repositories, delete repositories, list your repositories. So here's an example. You create a repository by typing AWS CodeCommit, create repository, repository name, whatever, and you get back a whole load of information. I wanted to have a little aside here, just to talk about a tool called JQ. Is anyone in the room familiar with JQ? Yeah, fantastic tool. I can't think off the top of my head who wrote it, but it's fantastic. Essentially, it's a JSON parser that you can put into any bash script you like or use on the command line. So just going back to the previous slide, here's the output from a create repository call through CodeCommit, you can use JQ to pull out just the repository URL. It's a pretty typical thing you want to do when you create a new repository. So you see the JQ bit there at the end of the slide. You just reference, if I go back a bit, you'll see the JSON body has a property called repository metadata, and within that, I want the property clone URL SSH. So I can just pipe the output of the CodeCommit command through to JQ. Just do .repository metadata .clone URL SSH. Quite straightforward. You can do similar things with lists. So if I want to list all the repos I've got, if I call CodeCommit list repositories, I get back a JSON object. You can use JQ just to pull back just the parts you want. Little aside there. So another thing that I do when I'm using CodeCommit, when you want to use CodeCommit, you need to give some SSH credentials to IAM so it knows who you are. When you do that, IAM gives you a unique username, which is generally something really friendly like that, APKBI, whatever. The official instructions then tell you that when you're setting up your repository, you add a remote like that, you do git remote add origin, and then your really nice, friendly username at all of the CodeCommit URL. That's fine. Gets a bit painful when you have to do like 50 of these. So what I do is put something in my SSH config. There we go. So you can set up a, basically you're creating an alias for the host, right? So I've created a host called CodeCommit, and I've said the user is always going to be this, and the host name is always going to be this. And then when I set up my remote, I can just do add origin CodeCommit / v1 repos, whatever the repo name is. That's a little bit less painful. So right, for my target application, which as I mentioned is pretty exciting, I'm going to walk you through the infrastructure. The infrastructure being code, it's going to be Cloudformation. So here is the entirety of the Cloudformation for my sample project. I create an S3 bucket with public read. There's the name of the bucket. It's Engledow is my username. It's useful to prefix buckets with that so I don't clash with anyone else. And I've set it up as a website, and index.html is the index document. I then output from the Cloudformation stack the URL of the website. So I'll take you over to my console. You can see I've already started the stack, called it Hello Stack. And if I take you to the Resources tab, you'll see there's a bucket. So there's an index document in that bucket, and not much else going on. It's just got the standard tags and no other settings. It's just got the static website hosting as per the Cloudformation. Oh, and outputs, of course. Here's the output. I get the URL to the website. So to deploy this infrastructure, I've set up a pipeline, which I'll talk through in a little bit. I make some change to the source code locally. I push it up to CodeCommit. It then goes through CodePipeline. It runs a test stage, which essentially just validates the template. You can do other fun stuff there. You can include tools like CFN-NAG. If you're not familiar with that and you use Cloudformation, go and have a look at that. CFN-Lint, any other kind of linting tools that you want to put into your pipeline, you can build into a code build job in your code pipeline. Then there's a build stage at which it creates a Cloudformation change set, and I'll show you one of those in a moment, and then finally the deploy stage. So no time like the present, let's make a change. So all I'm going to do is add a tag. There we go, committed my change. Bear with me while it asks me for my password. Okay, right, I've pushed that up to CodeCommit, so the pipeline is doing its thing now. I'll come back to it later. So I'm going to talk about the application itself now. I did mention that it was really exciting, and what it is just exactly what we all wanted, another static site generator. So I've got a template file, which is HTML. I take the current timestamp, I put that through a Python function and output index.html, which is basically just a page that says, well, in fact, I'll show you. There you go. It says hello, and it says built at whenever I did this sometime yesterday. Very similar steps to deployment as for the infrastructure side of things. I push changes up to CodeCommit. Some unit tests are run. You can imagine the unit tests are pretty exciting for this code. Then it generates the index page and then pushes it into S3. Job done. And again, no time like the present. So I'm just going to edit my template. Just change it from hello to hello AWS Loft. Okay, again, that will be going through a pipeline, which I'll walk you through in a moment. So there are two pipelines I've got set up. There's one which is hooked up to the infrastructure repository in CodeCommit, runs through a test stage, which is using CodeBuild. And then there's a Cloudformation stage, which generates a change set, and then a final Cloudformation stage to execute that change set. The benefit of using CodePipeline rather than scripting this entire thing is that each of these stages are separate jobs. If any one of them fails, I can see within CodePipeline where it's failed. I can get through to details to see why it's failed. Similarly for the application, it's hooked up to CodeCommit, the app repo, runs some unit tests, then it builds. The output is just the index.html, and then the deploy stage puts it into S3. So I'm just going to walk you through those. So here's the infrastructure pipeline. See, there's a source stage, a test stage, a stage, and a deploy stage. So you can see at the moment the test stage is in progress. The source stage having finished, so it's picked up the code from CodeCommit, put it through. You might be thinking this is taking a while, but bear in mind each of these stages is a code build job, which essentially spins up a Docker container, runs your code. So you sort of sacrifice speed for the ultimate flexibility you get of being able to have whatever you want in your build process. But it won't take too long. I can click on details. I've just had a message over here that says people want to know how I built the presentation. There's two things at play here. There's a tool called MDP, which is Markdown presentations. So this was just Markdown. And the second thing that makes it look like this is something called Cool Retro Term. So yeah, go and have a look at those. The slides afterwards will be in a very boring PowerPoint. But come and see me if you want the source code, it's fine. It's Markdown. I think I'll be okay sharing that. Okay, so here's the test stage from the infrastructure pipeline. You probably can't read that too well, but it says running command, AWS CloudFormation validate template, and uses the local file as the template body, which is received from CodeCommit, and all you get back is just a body with no errors, which tells you that it's fine. So it's onto the stage now. I wish I'd called it something else, which will be creating a CloudFormation change set. Go through to the application pipeline, pretty similar. It's got a code commit part. It's picked up the code. It's gone through a test stage. I'll just show you the details of that. As exciting as they are, it runs Python unit test standard unit test library. So you can see it's running Python-m unit test, and I get back run one test, everything okay. Which is good to know, because this would have taken a lot longer otherwise. So it's going through the build stage now, which will be running code, spitting out the index.html. And I'll just show you how that's wired up. So if I look at this build stage here, the input artifact is my app, which is defined by the source commit section, code commit rather. So code commit has an output artifact called my app, which bubbles all the way through the pipeline and gets picked up here as the input artifact to this code build job. That means that everything contained within that artifact, and coming from code commit, it's the source code, gets handed over to code build, and it does whatever it does, and the build specification in there, I'll show you that in a second, produces an output, and that output goes into an artifact called my app build. That output artifact, you won't be too surprised to learn, is the input artifact to the deploy stage. So that my app build, which just contains a file index.html, goes through this final job, and all that does is just runs AWS S3 copy to copy the file over to the S3 bucket. So I said I'd show you the build spec, just so you can see how that works. So I've got this code build job configured to use the buildspec.yaml in the source code. I'll take you over to the source code. And here's the YAML file. All I've defined here is a build phase, and it runs one command. It runs python generator.py, pipes it out to a file called index.html, and I specify an artifact which contains one file called index.html. Fairly straightforward. So just talking about the pipelines a little bit more. I said at the beginning I wanted to apply some principles to the way I work. Everything is code, that's all version controlled, etc. That means that your pipeline's got to be code, and you can describe a pipeline in Cloudformation. That pipeline, if you want to make changes to the pipeline, needs a pipeline. Very meta, as it says there. And the pipelines for the pipeline will have to be code as well. You don't need a pipeline for the pipeline for the pipeline, because you can use the pipeline for the pipeline. That all makes sense. It's fine. So just as an example there, you have a pipeline repo. That's a repository that describes your pipeline in Cloudformation. Have a code pipeline where that code gets picked up, runs through a test, whatever that might be, CFN, NAG, any other linters you want to run, creates a change set, executes it, exactly the same as the infrastructure pipeline I've got for my application. So I'm just going to see if those have run. It'd be nice to demonstrate to you that it works. Okay, so all the stages have succeeded here. And this is for the application pipeline. Go back to the infrastructure pipeline. Yeah, all done here as well. So I can take you back to the S3 bucket. Remember the change I put in was to add a new tag. Four tags, there we go. So name, hello, AWS Loft. Job done. And then the workshop demo, refresh that page, hello AWS Loft, and it was built today at 11:15 GMT. I guess the only other thing to show you would be the change set, just in case you're not familiar with Cloudformation change sets. So where you can stage changes to a Cloudformation stack, and then you can see what changes are going to be applied. In fact, I'll show you the details. So there you go. Probably not overly readable from there, but it walks you through essentially the fact that a tag set has been added and nothing else has been changed about the stack there. So the changes have all gone through, the pipeline's worked. pretty straightforward. So onto the appendix, probably the other definition of appendix. As I said at the beginning, don't forget you don't have to use CodeCommit. You can integrate with GitHub, as a lot of people are using today. Something else I mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, no, that's the next point. The workflow that I've presented here is just my kind of personal workflow. This is how I work. I make my changes locally. I run local unit tests. I don't tend to run the application locally because I'm building stuff for the cloud. So what I'll have is a complete non-production environment set up in an account somewhere. I'll run this pipeline. It all gets deployed. And I don't need to run too much code locally. But the workflow really should suit your application. So you might want to, for example, combine your infrastructure and application into one package. Depending on how you work and who you're working with, that can make sense versus splitting them out. I've split them out because typically I'm working with enterprise customers who generally want to have one set of guys who are in control of the infrastructure and another set of guys who are in charge of the stuff that runs on it. But if you're running a relatively small team and everybody does everything, it makes sense to keep everything in one repo. So you've got your repository describes your entire application. Also, it's pretty trivial to add in manual approval steps to all of this. So as part of my infrastructure pipeline, I could have included a manual approval step after I create the change set, which would give me then an opportunity to go and inspect that change set, make sure nothing untoward is happening. And lastly, I mentioned I would talk about some features that aren't in CodeCommit. Pull requests, not there. I've put yet in brackets. I don't know if it's coming, but you can be pretty sure it's a very heavily requested feature because, I mean, GitHub's made that way of working really popular. For now, personally, when I'm working with other folks and we're using CodeCommit, there are several ways you can work around this. You can do it the old way, you know, as Linus Torvalds did with Git when he first created it. If you want to make a change, you can use I think it's Git AM, and it will output something that you can email to somebody, and they can then import that email, and they get your local changes. Or you can just all have a repository each, and when you have a change that you want me to import, give me access to your repo. I add it as another remote to my local repository. I'll pull your changes, merge them locally, all fine. But something else I've done, which is a little bit more clever in the past, and something I'm hoping, just as a very small project, that I'll open source at some point soon, is a pull request style workflow just using CodePipeline. It's pretty straightforward to do. I mean, same kind of idea as GitHub. Everybody gets a repository of their own, and the workflow works such that if you make a change, you go and request that it gets merged into the sort of master, and it goes through a code pipeline job, which can handle the merge. At the end of the day, it's just basically just a code build project, and all it runs is git merge. Not much to do there. Okay, so walk through a number of things there. So take some time now for any questions and any bits that you want to look into a bit deeper. There's a question at the back here.
Cool. So you've got your stage. So if we wanted to change that to give it a better name, and then we want to run it on the non-master branch of the info pipeline, can you not do it? Can you just walk through how I edit the code that finds the info pipeline?
So the question was about making changes to the pipeline. If I wanted to, for example, change the name of the stage. As I said, I wish I'd given it a better name, and have it based off a different branch.
So then the actual info pipeline goes, I always run on my master branch, yeah?
Yep.
Or a separate branch. I've got another branch on my info repo, and work out my new candidate, new pipeline.
Yep. So a couple of different ways of dealing with that. You could have multiple pipelines, right? So you could have a non-prod pipeline and a prod pipeline and kind of hard code all the values. But probably a more efficient way to do things, if you don't have too many different changes, and you shouldn't, between non-prod and prod, is to have a single pipeline, and you can bubble environment variables through the pipeline. So you could, for example, have the branch name going through the pipeline along with the final destination, or things like bucket name. You can pass those in as parameters to the Cloudformation.
Sorry, so where does this pipeline definition live in my system?
So that's a piece of Cloudformation. Let me step back a few pages. You can define your pipeline. I've gone too far. There we go. So you'll have a pipeline repository which will describe your pipeline in Cloudformation. I don't have one for this, but I have a pipeline that I think I could show you. Well, in fact, probably just straightforward if I show the Cloudformation documentation for it. There we go. So we're looking there. Yep. Sorry, you'll have to repeat that.
So in my info repo, how do I point for a particular branch to a particular version of that there?
Of the pipeline. So you want to deploy a particular version of your.
I want to use a new version of my pipeline.
Yep.
Parallelization to make sure we stay much better than the old one.
Yep.
I'm not ready to use the new master yet, so you can still find out the main line. I'm going to try them out with my.
Okay, right. So you've got a new proposed version of a pipeline. You want to deploy your new pipeline to a non-prod environment. Okay. So, I mean, this takes you back to the pipeline. You'll have a pipeline for deploying your pipeline, right? So that's simply just pushing the appropriate version to the branch that you've agreed for the pipeline and letting it all bubble through. So at the end of the day, it's going to be a change to a piece of Cloudformation, which will result in a change set, and your new pipeline will be rolled out. Okay, any more questions on parts of this? Yep.
You said it integrates with GitHub. Does it integrate with GitHub Enterprise accounts?
Good question. I think so. I'll have to go and look at the docs. Ian probably knows. Okay, I mean, a pretty simple way to integrate with anything is that you can trigger a code pipeline from a change to some objects in S3. So if you can get your code from wherever it is into S3, which is, generally quite trivial, you can trigger it that way. Okay, any more questions or parts of this to dive into? Yep, one here at the front.
Probably use CodeBuild to do a Windows build. Is that something I can just configure with an off-the-shelf Windows container that you provide, or do I need to print my own image?
So you can possibly tell that I'm not a Windows guy. There's some stuff up here that might give it away. Never tried, to be honest. I've never tried a CodeBuild Windows build. But the documentation's great, so it'll be easy to find out. Another question here.
The question is, I know that you have for now creating a pipeline, create a code from it. This thing might do something like CloudFormation design.
I think I'm going to have to come a bit closer, sorry.
So I'm saying there's this CloudFormation designer, some kind of like a template that you can use it to actually create a code from an existing environment, like whatever you have in deployed. Just wonder if you have plans for do the same for pipelines, so you can actually create this, let's say, CloudFormation code from your existing pipelines. I mean, it's more like because when you deploy it's more about when you manage your pipelines. Let's say if I want to change anything in this pipeline, I should just change the code that is creating a pipeline, deploy it, build, and that way I know it's new table and it's what I have in my CloudFormation code created. Otherwise, it's kind of, it will diverge. So just wonder if you have a plans to kind of maybe do the same with this CloudFormation designer. I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, so essentially I think the question is there a way to go back from, say you've made some manual changes to a pipeline, can you then import that back into CloudFormation? So in general terms, there's a tool called Cloudformation, if you're familiar with that, right? But I don't think it supports CodePipeline. No. I mean, really, the answer is don't make manual changes to the pipeline. Change them in the source code. I mean, the same kind of applies to an application. If you deployed an application, typically you're not going to log into the server, make changes to it live, and then go and reapply them back to your source code. So really just going back to the principles that I put up on the screen earlier, treat everything as source code. So if it's source code, you don't go messing around with the built artifact. Sure, I agree. I mean, I set up these pipelines by hand to start with because it's quite straightforward. Just an easy way for me to sort of play and figure out what I'm going to do. But then afterwards, yeah, it's a manual process to go write those, but once you've done a few, you're very familiar with it.
That's another question.
Sure.
This about like using Lambdas, go with, let's say, one code pipeline and just make like environment variables for different Lambdas development, or just like three different, new pipelines for like every Lambda deployed. Or
This-
just like anything, I don't know. Infrastructure is like, let's say, 20 Lambdas. Is there different code pipelines for everyone, or like,
So are you asking about deploying Lambda functions using CodePipeline? Yeah. And just the same as any other job, you can use a CodeBuild job, and at the end of the day, CodeBuild is just a container. You can run whatever you like in it. And you can pick up all the environment variables along the way there and deploy straight through to the Lambda function. Something else I didn't mention also is that Lambda functions can be used in a code pipeline. You can have what's called an invoke stage. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, I've got one here. If we create the pipeline using AWS Pipeline, we should never use the console to modify it, right? I would agree with that. Yep. Ideally, you stick to the principles of treating things as code. If you create it with a pipeline and then you go modify it, you're asking for trouble, sure.
If you've got, say, a Lambda function that has credentials from a self-service, and that varies between, say you've got a development stage and production and equivalent external services, how would you manage the credentials for the external service for the manager group?
I'm going to have to get back for the end of that, sorry.
So, if you've got a development platform stage and production, and
Yep.
they all integrate with an external service, and you basically use three different accounts for the dev stage and production versions of that. How would you manage your pipeline pulling in the appropriate credentials for its stage?
Okay, so if you've got a pipeline that's integrating with external services, yeah, so not other AWS services, how would you deal with the credentials? There's a number of different ways. You could look at using something like the SSM parameter store. You familiar with that? Yeah. So you can have a parameter store storing a number of different bits of information, and you'll give your pipeline a role that gives it access to that parameter store. I think probably now that's the best way to do it. You certainly don't want to go putting credentials into source code. Okay, any more questions? Or have we reached the end of the question stream? Okay, in that case, thank you very much for listening to me talk about how I do development. Be interested if you want to come up and see me afterwards and tell me how you do things, particularly any niggles you find with CodeCommit, CodePipeline, etc. I'll be interested in hearing about those. Unless you want to talk about pull requests.